we'll talk about it later for sure.
All right. Hello, all, and thank you for being here with us, attending our civil society discussion on why Canada needs an agenda for disarmament. My name is Vanessa Lantain, and I'm the National Coordinator of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. I would like to start off by saying that VOW's national office, as well as myself right now, are located on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today is National Indigenous Peoples Day, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. If you don't know which Indigenous peoples land that you are currently on, I'm going to put a link in the chat, which can be a first step to learning more about Canada's past and ongoing colonialism of the First Peoples. But right now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about VOW, which is the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. So disarmament for VOW has been central since its inception. In 1960, we came together for nuclear disarmament. VOW pushed for disarmament and peace at the Fourth World Conference for Women and the Beijing Platform for Action in 1995. And VOW is one of the network members of ICANN that won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. So if you would like to become a member or donate to our organization and our disarmament campaign, I will be posting a link shortly where you can join, renew, or donate. So for this event, we have incredible speakers, polls, breakout rooms where you can give your thoughts on disarmament, and you will get a chance to ask questions as well after the breakout rooms if there's any lingering burning questions you have. So I'm just going to reiterate the standard Zoom housekeeping rules, which we're all pretty familiar with, I think, by now, which is only respectful comments and questions in the chat, and to please keep your microphone muted so as not to interrupt our speakers. It's going to be a wonderful event. I know when I first learned about disarmament and the potential it has to transform our societies, it was so refreshing to me to hear about a solution to so many of our pressing issues. The ever increasing military budgets have so much potential to be diverted to life-saving social needs, which is why I'm so excited to hear from our panel and from you about disarmament. So I'm going to put up a quick poll shortly, which should come up on your screens. If you don't see it, don't worry. It's just to get an idea of our audience, but it's not mandatory. And I'm now going to hand it over to Ashwini, who is our lead peace campaigner for disarmament, who made this event possible. Thank you, Ashwini.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for those introductory comments, and I will just share my screen. So thank you, everyone. Hi and greetings to you all. My name is Ashwini Salvakumaran. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the peace campaigner for disarmament with the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, also known as WOW. And it is my absolute pleasure, to be able to speak with you all today from Milton, Ontario, which is also known as the traditional land of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. On behalf of WOW, I first want to offer a sincere thank you to all of you for being here today, alongside our wonderful panel of speakers, Paul Meyer, Alison Pitlock, Branka Marijan, and Rachel Small, whom we will hear from shortly. Thank you all for your ongoing powerful work and continued activism regarding disarmament. In the spirit of our discussion on disarmament and sustainable peace, I would like to take a few minutes now to provide an overview of WOW's incoming campaign, why Canada needs an agenda for disarmament, and the important role you all play in making our grassroots campaign a reality. So, disarmament relies on the sophisticated, nonviolent practice of conflict prevention, diplomacy, and mediation. It courageously creates the space for reimagining the concept of security and re envisioning the role of the state. It can also liberate international relations from the threat and use of armed force. 3 years ago, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres urged member states to make disarmament a priority and launched Securing Our Common Future, an agenda for disarmament. The agenda explains that disarmament can be achieved through measures such as the elimination and destruction of weapons, prohibitions and restrictions, non-proliferation, regulation, transparency, alongside remediation. The Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Handbook, known as PNND, echoes these calls for disarmament action and confidence-building protocols. Unfortunately, the Government of Canada and the Parliament of Canada still have not performed a comprehensive public study on disarmament. In fact, the last time the Senate or the House of Commons performed a study on disarmament was over 30 years ago. According to NATO's defense expenditures latest report, Canada's defense spending has dramatically increased over the past 5 years to 30.8 billion, which now constitutes about 1.31% of our GDP. Canada cannot afford to meet NATO's 2% target for military spending. This is why WOW is calling upon the Canadian government to make disarmament a political priority and revisit our defense budget. We are concerned about the rise of military spending due to NATO and the growing militarism in Canada, with the startling increase of fighter jet purchases alongside armed drones, attack helicopters, and the building of new warships. Now more than ever, Canada needs disarmament for climate justice and to drive sustainable peace and development. Disarmament is essential to maintain international peace and security, protect civilians, and promote sustainable development. It is also capable of supporting the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular SDG number 3, which is good health and well-being, SDG number 8, which is decent work and economic growth, and SDG number 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions. We strongly believe that the current funding can be invested into First Nations communities to provide vital support and aid, alongside committing to tackling our domestic crises. We have recently published a 2-page handout entitled Why Canada Needs an Agenda for Disarmament, which entails some of our key asks. These include developing a national action plan on disarmament and conducting a public analysis of military spending that considers the opportunity costs alongside a few of our other requests. You can find our full handout by going to the bottom of our webpage on disarmament and clicking download. Now, this is why today we are so pleased you can all join us to provide your valuable input and feedback on how WOW can build a much needed grassroots national campaign to get the federal government to create an agenda for disarmament for Canada. We need to stop the growing militarization of Canadian foreign policy and put disarmament, diplomacy, and peacekeeping back at the center of our international affairs. I will now turn it back over to Vanessa to play an important clip from the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. Thank you.
Throughout history, countries have pursued disarmament to stop arms races, build trust, and protect people from harm. Disarmament has been central to the work of the United Nations since its founding, and it is critical for building a more secure and peaceful world. But what actually is disarmament? For the United Nations, this means 1. The elimination of weapons of mass destruction. 2. The regulation of conventional weapons and balanced reduction of armed forces. And 3. Making sure that new technologies are used in line with international norms. So why does disarmament matter? Access to weapons doesn't necessarily cause conflict, but it can encourage, intensify, and prolong it. Disarmament and arms control play a critical role in preventing and ending crises and armed conflict. Disarmament can also reduce an immense financial burden on societies. In 2019 alone, world military spending was $1,917 billion, the highest since the Cold War. That's about $250 for every single person in the world, and over 12 times what the wealthy world spends on aid. The cost of a single stealth fighter is enough to put 200,000 children through a year of school. The cost of one battle tank is enough to treat 26,000 people for malaria. And this isn't counting the cost of what is destroyed and the lives lost and ruined because of conflicts. The world is overarmed and peace is underfunded. Sustainable development can only happen in a safe and secure environment. And we need disarmament to help provide that.
Great. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for sharing that video. And without further ado, we are going to get into our panel of speakers, starting with Paul Meyer. So thank you so much, Paul, for being here, and we look extremely forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you, Ashrini, and greetings to all those participating in this event. It really is timely for the Voice of Women to be drawing attention to the fact that Canada lacks a disarmament agenda and has done so for many years. One has to go back to 1998 to find a substantive official document devoted to arms control and disarmament. This was the report of the Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs of the House of Commons under the then chairmanship of Bill Graham, entitled Canada and the Nuclear Challenge, Reducing the Political Value of Nuclear Weapons. In response to this report, the government provided a white paper in April 1999 that outlined the official policy on the subject and committed to several steps, including annual consultations with civil society groups and appearances by the ambassador for disarmament before the Foreign Affairs Committee. All this attention faded rapidly in the subsequent years. The commitments made for consultations and committee hearings were respected for a few years and then allowed to peter out, without the Foreign Affairs Committee seeming very concerned about this. Supporting capacity for arms control and disarmament, like the Verification Research Unit that was housed in the then Department of Foreign Affairs, were gradually starved of funds and then terminated. If we fast forward to the advent of the government of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, it decided, instead of launching a foreign policy review, to focus only on the defense and development sectors. The two outcomes of the review were issued in 2017. Not surprisingly, the defense review did not address disarmament. And somewhat more surprisingly, nor did the development one. Although issued with the title Feminist International Assistance Policy, it didn't acknowledge that weapons from nuclear warheads to anti-personnel landmines posed not only a serious threat to development, but also to feminist values. When the then Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland, made a rare foreign policy statement to the House of Commons on June 6, 2017, she didn't have a single reference to arms control and disarmament. The Trudeau government has promised to produce a feminist foreign policy, and late last year engaged in some consultations with NGOs on its contents. The government discussion paper accompanying these consultations didn't mention disarmament, and with respect to nuclear weapons, only expressed concern over their proliferation, not their very existence, with all the attendant risk of nuclear use, accidental or intentional. The Canadian Pugwash Group was one of those submitting a brief calling for a return of disarmament and a reinvestment in diplomacy and the peaceful settlement of disputes. An obligation, by the way, of all UN member states under the UN Charter. In May 2018, the UN Secretary General released his agenda for disarmament with proposals for UN member states to consider. The Secretary General can propose, but it is the states themselves that decide whether to act on those proposals. Regrettably, to date, there has been little reference to or support for his recommendations. This, despite the growth in geopolitical tensions, the termination of arms control agreements, and blatant saber rattling. It is time for Canada to put the disarmament word back into its official vocabulary. A campaign by civil society to advocate for this is a step in the right direction. It once was said that Canada, and I quote, Canada had disarmament in its DNA. It is time to restore this life force in the body politic. I wish you a productive consultation on this important theme. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Paul, for providing such wonderful introductory remarks. And we are so grateful to have you here to participate and provide your contributions today. So, our next speaker was going to be Alison Pitlack from WILF Canada, but unfortunately, she's experiencing some internet issues. So, we are going to move right into Branka Marajan. So, thank you, Branka, for being here. And we are so excited to hear from you.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to all of you. My name is Branka Marian, and I'm a senior researcher at Project Plowshares. At Plowshares, we deal with several issues, but I'm going to focus on emerging technologies today. As Paul clearly outlined, disarmament in Canada is underfunded and under-resourced. So we lack the diplomatic staff to deal with these issues. We lack the resources of various levels of government. And I think this is very short-sighted for a number of reasons Paul outlined, but I will also add to these that the kinds of challenges that we're going to be facing in future conflicts require Canada to develop a techno-diplomacy. And techno-diplomacy is nothing new for countries. They've dealt with this a lot during the Cold War, but we seem to be ill-prepared for the types of challenges that we're witnessing with emerging technologies, including from having better export control policies to address exports of Canadian technologies to conflict zones, to regimes which will abuse their citizens, which will infringe on human rights. So my proposal is to rethink disarmament, or to add to disarmament this element of the new technologies, and to consider what we are seeing and where the discussion is internationally. So one of the issues that I deal with a lot is autonomous weapon systems. And autonomous weapon systems are systems where the selection and engagement of targets is carried out by essentially algorithms. So human control over those systems is often, well, if it's a fully autonomous weapon system, would be absent. And there are UN discussions on this issue, and they've been going on for some time, since 2014. But interestingly, Canada and our foreign minister has the mandate to support not only these discussions, but actually to support a ban on fully autonomous weapon systems. I think this case and this particular mandate is very instructive to us to understand where Canada's disarmament policy is and how it's being pursued. So this mandate has been in existence, first given to the former Foreign Minister Champagne, and then it has been passed on to Marc Garneau. However, we have not heard a single statement from the Foreign Minister on this issue. And indeed, from my understanding, there will likely be some support for the efforts from the Canadian government, but it doesn't seem likely that we would actually support a ban on fully autonomous weapons, as is currently outlined. So I think one of the challenges presented in this particular issue is that even when there is a mandate, even when there is sort of official rhetoric, we don't see follow through. And that challenge for Canada is, I think, quite visible on the international stage. And this is where we've seen countries like Ireland particularly step up and take leadership in disarmament venues. It's also a place where we're missing pursuing our own economic and national interests as well, and ensuring that our innovation ecosystems, if you want to say it like that, are also benefiting individuals around the world. And we haven't really captured, I think, the ways in which we could pursue our techno diplomacy yet. So on that point, I would just really highlight that we need to be much more thoughtful about how technology is being used, how it's being created, the kinds of technologies that we're going to see. So we oftentimes focus on artificial intelligence. There's also challenges of quantum computing. There will be challenges with additive manufacturing. All of these new technologies also mean that we, on the other side, as civil society, have to be equipped, prepared, we have to be knowledgeable, and we have to propose alternative policies and regulations. And that kind of development of a disarmament policy has to be one that is forward thinking, and that addresses these challenges that will come. So along with everything that has been outlined in terms of the security challenges, all of these new technologies will cut across the board. So we'll see them in nuclear issues. We see this with discussions on cyber and the threshold of conflict moving, the threshold of conflict, potential conflict escalation in response to cyber crimes and issues. So we are, I think, at a critical moment where we can start designing these kinds of policies and to propose alternatives. So I have a lot to say on this, and it's really challenging to summarize it in a few minutes. But I would suggest that we don't overlook these future challenges and that we ensure that they are also a part of this disarmament agenda being proposed. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Branka. And once again, we appreciate you alongside Paul being here today and giving such wonderful contributions. And last but not least, we will move into remarks by Rachel Small. Thanks, Rachel, for being here. And we can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Ashwini, and thanks to Val for organizing this event and for really bringing us together. I think that these spaces where movements and organizers and civil society can come together don't happen often enough, and to do so at the start of a campaign, I think is invaluable. So thank you so much. I'm the campaign organizer with World Beyond War, which is a global grassroots network that's advocating for the abolition of war and its replacement with a just and sustainable peace. And we often think of the entirety of our mission really as being about disarmament, with a type of disarmament that includes the whole war machine, the whole institution of war, so beyond weapons, but really the whole military industrial complex. And at least half of our work is about taking concrete steps to build an alternative global security system, so one that's based on demilitarizing security, managing conflict non-violently, creating a culture of peace. So what we do really ties into this conversation tonight in a bunch of different ways. As we've heard already tonight, and from the very first introductory words of this webinar, Canada currently has a very strong armament agenda. This is the current state of affairs, and it's very far from where we want to go. I think we really are talking about a complete course reversal, and really deconstructing the reigning common sense here, which, while it's in no way evidence-based, I think there is no evidence to show that our militarism decreases violence or promotes peace. It nonetheless is the water that we swim in right now. And I was thinking right before this event about my favorite quote by Ursula Le Guin, which is, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." So I was reminding myself, yes, this is the current state of affairs, but it's something that's been built by humans and it can be unbuilt. I think we've got something big ahead of us. And this is a brave conversation to have and to start at this particular time. At a practical and immediate level, I think foremost in my mind, talking about disarmament right here, right now, is that we need to cancel the current plans to stock up on warships, the 88 new bomber planes Canada's poised to buy, the first ever armed drones the Canadian military has decided it needs. These are, in my mind, some of the immediate hurdles we face when we're talking about disarmament. But also, I hope we can consider that a disarmament agenda for Canada needs to start with Canada's growing role as well as a major arms dealer and producer. If we're talking about disarmament and the global impacts on our global solidarity, the fact that we're currently one of the world's top arms dealer, the second biggest to the whole Middle East region, this needs to be, I think, part of our conversation about disarmament, as does our enormous investment in and subsidizing of weapons company, of arms industry, as does our work with the labor movement alongside these workers. How can we transition them and support their transition to the industries that they'd much rather work in? Some other thoughts that I wanted to share as we start this conversation here tonight together on disarmament is that I think a disarmament movement gaining steam now, I think, needs to look quite different from those of past decades. I think it'll be really exciting that something we start now is going to be foundationally intersectional and needs to be. I think it needs to center right from the start who is impacted first and worst by these arms, from the very initial point where the mining of the materials for these toxic war machines starts, the communities around those mine sites, the workers there whose lungs are contaminated, right from that very point to who is being harmed at the other end, where the bombs fall. And think about the enormous array of allies we have going into this work as well, who need to be brought in, I think, right from the beginning. How do we work alongside, how do we build a disarmament agenda that includes and centers movements to disarm police? This is part of disarmament, and increasingly these police forces across Canada are actually receiving weaponry and arms from the military. And if they're not receiving the weapons themselves, they're getting trained by the military. Looking, for example, at the violence that Indigenous people face across Turtle Island, they are vastly disproportionately being recruited by the military and RCMP, often with funds that are dedicated to lovely sounding budget lines like First Nations youth in the federal budget. And then you find out, oh, it's RCMP and military recruitment camps and programs and summer camps. So they're disproportionately recruited, but then they're also disproportionately on the other end of militarized violence. And especially when we look at those at the front lines of the climate crisis, especially Indigenous communities, it's militarized violence that's shutting down those movements, and militarized surveillance through police, but also through the defense forces itself that are surveilling those movements. So disarmament is just, I think, right from the start connected to all our movements of social justice and decolonization across Turtle Island. Beyond that, I think right from the start, how do we build a disarmament campaign truly alongside those around the world who have been bombed, who have been attacked, whose environment has been destroyed because of Canadian militarism and our NATO partners. From World Beyond War's perspective, we take a definition of disarmament sort of much further than the UN conception. I do really appreciate that video that was shared, and I think some of us understand disarmament in a more radical way and as a truly confrontational demand. I think coming together in this way as movements with different tactics and different approaches is incredibly important, and the menu of options we have to use in this struggle is very diverse. I think our tactics need to be diverse. I imagine right off the bat that I'm seeing in this participant list people who have experience with everything from how do we campaign the federal government to undertake a study, how do we do a direct action, how do we undertake community development initiatives around disarmament, how do we block weapons sales, block their transport, block their development, how do we do campaigns to divest our communities, our institutions, our cities, our pension funds from weapons and militarism, how do we demilitarize police forces? I see a lot of that expertise is in the room already here today, and that's really exciting to me. So those are a few of my jumbled thoughts going into this really exciting conversation. Thanks again for starting it.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I do agree, disarmament should be intersectional and also intergenerational. And it's great to see how many youth are here as well and are very passionate about advocating for the cause. So thank you so much again to Paul, Branka, and Rachel for those wonderful introductory remarks. And we will now be moving into the second component of our event, which is our breakout room discussion. So very shortly, everyone in the audience will be invited to join a small breakout room that is going to be led by either one or two youth facilitators or members from WOW or Science for Peace. And each facilitator has a series of prompts and questions that will help stimulate a further discussion on how we all can come together and construct our grassroots campaign and disarmament movement. So I would ask you all to please remember your breakout room group number, as when we come back to the main session in about 30 minutes, we are going to ask one volunteer from each breakout room to provide a very short summary of your group's discussion and highlight the main action items you have all come up with. So feel free to introduce yourself and really discuss what it is about today's event that intrigued you and what you'd like to contribute to WOW's disarmament campaign. And you should now be receiving an invite to join the rooms, and we will see you all back here in about 30 minutes. Thank you.